Every morning at 4:30, a girl wakes up in a hole beneath the kitchen floor. Not a bedroom, a crawl space. She sleeps in her boots because the woman upstairs doesn't give her time to put them on. She sleeps with her arms crossed over her ribs. Because the last time she was kicked awake, something cracked and never healed right. For 3 years, this girl has been fed, beaten, and broken by the one person the law says is supposed to protect her. But here's what nobody in this town knows. The woman isn't just hitting her, she's poisoning her. Slowly, every single night. In the gravy. And the whole town? They see the bruises. They see the girl walking with pig slop still in her hair. And they do nothing. But one morning, a stranger rides into town. A cowboy with a scar on his face and a past he can't outrun. He notices what everyone else chose to ignore. And the girl? She's not waiting to be rescued. She's been hiding evidence under the floorboards, planning something no one sees coming. What happens next will shake this town to its foundation. The lesson. You don't have to wait for someone to save you. Sometimes survival starts the moment you stop believing the lies they told you about yourself. The meaning. This is a story about the quiet violence of silence. How an entire town can watch a girl suffer and choose comfort over courage. But it's also about what happens when one person decides to stop being invisible. Ellie didn't escape because someone broke down the door. She escaped because she learned the truth, hid the proof, and used the only weapon she had, her mind and her memory. This story reminds us that the most dangerous prisons aren't made of walls. They're made of people who look away. If this story hit you somewhere deep, don't scroll past it. Drop a comment and tell me what city you're listening from tonight. I want to see how far Ellie's voice can travel. The morning started the way every morning started, in the dark. Ellie slept in the crawl space beneath the kitchen floor. It was not a proper cellar. It was a hole in the ground with a plank door and a dirt floor, and enough room to lie on her side if she pulled her knees to her chest. The air smelled of root vegetables going soft, and the copper tang of red Montana clay. She slept in her boots because Ida did not give her time to put them on. She slept with her arms crossed over her ribs because the last time Ida kicked her awake, she had caught her in the floating rib on the left side, and it still was not right 3 weeks later. She woke the way she always woke, not from a clock or from sunlight, from footsteps. Ida Puett-Dawson walked the kitchen floor above Ellie's head every morning at 4:30. The floorboards were thin pine, and Ellie had learned to read those footsteps the way a sailor reads the sky. Quick steps meant Ida was busy, had somewhere to be, had church business or a delivery to manage. Quick steps meant Ellie had maybe 2 hours of peace before the first order came down. Slow steps meant something else entirely. This morning the steps were slow. Ellie closed her eyes. She pressed her palms flat against the dirt floor and breathed. In through the nose, out through the mouth, the way her father had taught her when she was small and afraid of thunderstorms. Breathe, Ellie girl, just breathe. The storm will pass. But this storm had been going on for 3 years, and it had not passed yet. The plank door opened. Gray light poured in. Girl. Get up. Pigs are not fed. Ellie climbed out of the crawl space. Her hands were shaking. They always shook now. She could not remember when they had stopped being steady. She thought it was sometime in the 2nd year, but the days blurred together when you lived them on your knees. She grabbed the slop bucket from under the kitchen counter. Potato peels, stale bread, the grease Ida scraped from her own plate. Ellie carried it out the back door into the half-dark yard, where 6 hogs pressed against the pen rails, grunting and wet-mouthed and eager. She poured the slop into the trough. Her hands were shaking so bad that some of it splashed over the rim and hit the dirt. You spilled. Ida was on the porch, arms crossed, hair pinned perfect, cotton dress clean and pressed. She looked like a church deacon's wife. She looked like the kind of woman other women admired and wanted to sit next to at Sunday supper. That was the worst part. She looked like nothing was wrong. I'm sorry, Ma am. I will clean it up. You are always sorry. Ida stepped off the porch. She did not hurry. She never hurried when she was about to do something. She moved slow the way a person moves when they want you to feel every second of what is coming. Sorry does not feed pigs. Sorry does not earn keep. Sorry is what useless people say when they have got nothing else in them worth keeping. I will fix it, ma'am. I promise. Ida reached her. Ellie did not step back. Stepping back made it worse. She had learned that in the first month after her father died. You stand still. You take it. You breathe after. Ida's hand closed around the back of Ellie's neck. Her fingers were thin but strong, the grip of a woman who wrung chicken necks without flinching. She pushed Ellie's face down into the pig trough. The slop closed over her mouth and nose. Warm, rancid, thick with rot. It filled her nostrils and she gagged and her body bucked, but Ida held firm with both hands pressing down on the back of her skull. 17 seconds if she did not fight. The hogs nosed at her arms. They were confused, still hungry, snuffling at the slop around her face. 23 if she fought. She did not fight. Ida pulled her up. Ellie gasped. Slop dripped from her chin and her hair was plastered to her face. She did not cry. She had not cried in front of Ida since the first year. Crying was fuel. Crying made Ida smile. Clean yourself up. Ida wiped her hands on her apron like she had touched something diseased. Then get to the wash. Fenton's linens are due by noon. You are behind. Yes, ma'am. Ida walked back to the porch. She paused at the door. And Ellie? Ellie looked up. Ida almost never used her name. If I hear you talk to anyone in town today, anyone at all, you sleep in the pen tonight, not beside the pigs, with them. Do you understand? Yes, ma'am. The screen door shut. Ellie stood alone in the yard. A fly landed on her cheek, drawn by the slop still clinging to her skin. She did not swat it. She just stood there, dripping. Then she walked to the well, drew up a bucket, poured ice-cold water over her own head. She did it twice, 3 times, until the smell was mostly gone and her hands were a little steadier and she could feel her face again. She wrung out her hair, pulled it back with a strip of cloth, picked up the laundry basket. The walk into town was 20 minutes on a good day. Today was not a good day. She stopped twice on the road to grip the fence rail because the world tilted sideways, and the edges of her vision went gray. She thought it was hunger. She had not eaten since yesterday noon, and even that had been half a plate of beans, and the gravy Ida always put on everything. She kept walking. Redstone Gulch was a copper mining town dying on its feet. The ore was thinning out. Half the claims had gone dry the year before, and the men who worked them had moved on to Butte, or Anaconda, or wherever the next boom was promising. What was left was a single street of plank buildings coated in red dust, a saloon, a church, a dry goods store, and enough people to keep the post office open 3 days a week. Ellie walked the edge of the road the way she always walked, head down, shoulders curved in, making herself small. She passed the miners' camp where men with soot-black hands ate breakfast over open fires. She passed the livery stable. She passed the schoolhouse where children chased each other in the yard. Nobody greeted her. Some looked, most did not. Ida had told every woman at the church auxiliary that Ellie was touched in the head. Slow, dangerous even. The girl sets fires, Ida had whispered to the Reverend's wife. She hurts animals. I do my Christian duty keeping her, but she ain't right. None of it was true. But truth did not matter in a town where one woman controlled the egg supply and the church donation box. Ellie delivered the linens to Ruth Fenton's back door. Mrs. Fenton was a round woman with soft hands and a conscience she kept locked in a drawer. She took the basket without meeting Ellie's eyes. Thank you, girl. Payment is in the flour tin on the porch. Ellie picked up the tin. 3 copper pennies. For 6 hours of scrubbing on her hands and knees, every cent went to Ida. She turned to leave, and that was when she noticed it. Among the laundry bundles she was carrying back, the outgoing items she picked up from several houses, there was a sealed envelope tucked into the Whitley household's bundle. It was addressed to Ida Puitt. The return address bore the letterhead of a law office in Helena. Ellie did not open it. She would not dare. But she memorized the name and the address the way she memorized everything. Filed it away in the locked room of her mind, where she kept all the things she was not supposed to know. Why was Ida getting letters from a lawyer in Helena? She did not have time to think about it. She had to get back before Ida counted the minutes and found her short. On the road home, she heard cattle lowing from the south, a herd moving toward town, hooves raising a column of red dust that looked from a distance like smoke from a grass fire. She did not pay it any mind. Things that passed through Redstone Gulch never stayed. Cole Masterson had seen enough wounds to know the difference. A bruise from falling looked nothing like a bruise from being grabbed. Same as a horseshoe kick looked nothing like a knife cut. The girl on Fenton's back porch had the second kind on both wrists. He noticed because noticing was what kept you alive on the trail. You read the ground for snake holes. You read the sky for weather. You read people for trouble. It was not something he chose to do. It was something the war had beaten into him until it became the same as breathing. Cole had ridden into Redstone Gulch about 2 hours prior with 37 head of cattle, and a plan so simple it barely counted as one. Sell the beef, collect payment, ride on toward Oregon. He had been driving cattle since '66 when the war ended and left him with nothing but a scar on his face and a name that did not mean much in Texas anymore. A Union man from a Confederate state. His own mother had not written to him in 6 years. The scar ran from his left temple down to his jaw. Shrapnel from a cannon burst outside Petersburg. Not a brawl, not a knife fight. The mark of a man who had served. But most people who saw it assumed the worst, and Cole had stopped correcting them a long time ago. He had watered Bishop at the trough outside the livery and paid for a night's boarding. Bishop was a blue roan with a hard mouth and a good heart, and he was the closest thing Cole had to a permanent companion. They understood each other. Neither one talked much. Then he walked into town looking for a meal. The saloon was called Morrow's. The owner was a thick-armed man named Hank, with a face like a friendly bulldog, and a white apron that had not been white in some years. He poured Cole a whiskey without asking what he wanted, and Cole drank it in one swallow and sat there looking at the empty glass. He was sitting on the porch when he saw the girl. She came down the street carrying a laundry basket on her hip. Thin in the way working women got thin, not delicate. Just pared down to wire and bone, brown hair pulled back, shoulders hunched forward, walking the edge of the road like she was trying to take up as little space as the world would allow. Cole had seen that walk before. On green recruits being hazed by their sergeants, on horses that had been broken wrong, the walk of a living thing trying to become invisible. Then the sun caught something in her hair, crusted, yellowish. He squinted. Pig feed. And on her wrists, where the sleeves of her dress rode up, he saw the bruises. 4 finger shapes pressed into the skin like a brand. Not from a fall, from being grabbed. He watched her walk to Fenton's back porch, watched Mrs. Fenton take the laundry basket at the door without inviting the girl inside, watched the girl pick up a flour tin and count 3 pennies into her palm, watched her walk away with her head down and her shoulders curved, and that pig feed still stuck in her hair like nobody in the whole town could see it. Or maybe they could see it. Maybe they just did not care. "Who is that?" Cole said to Hank, who had come out to wipe down the porch railing. Hank's hand stopped moving, just for a second. Then he started wiping again. "Ellie Dawson, Sam Dawson's girl. Sam died in the copper mine collapse 3 years back. Good man. Best man in this town, if you want my honest word." And the mother. Dead. Died birthing Ellie. Sam married again. Woman named Ida Pewitt. Widow from Helena. Hank wrung the rag between his hands. Situation ain't good. He did not say more than that. He did not catalog the abuse or list the injuries or describe the pig trough. He said just enough, and then he stopped because he was afraid. Cole could see it. The way Hank's eyes cut toward the east end of town, and then cut away again. like a man who did not want to look at something, but could not help checking if it was still there. During the conversation, Hank poured himself 3 drinks. Cole counted. Cole did not say he was going to help. He did not make a speech. He finished his whiskey and paid for it and walked back to his camp south of town, where his cattle were grazing on leased pasture. He lay on his bedroll that night and stared at the sky. Montana sky in June was big enough to make a man feel like he had already died, and nobody told him. Stars all the way to the edges, no clouds, just black and white and the kind of silence that filled your chest and pressed down. He thought about Thomas. Not the whole story, not yet, just one image. Thomas, at 2 years old, standing in the doorway of the ranch house in Texas, his small hand wrapped around Cole's index finger, holding on while Cole tried to mount up for the war. The boy would not let go. Abigail had to peel his fingers off one by one, and Thomas had cried, and Cole had ridden away, and that was the last time he had touched his son. He did not know where Thomas was now. Abigail had left while Cole was at war, took the boy and vanished. Not with another man, not at first. She left because Cole came back different. The nightmares, the silence, the distance. She left because she was afraid of what the war had made him, and Cole could not blame her for that entirely because she was not entirely wrong. He lay there on his back in the grass, and he thought about Thomas, and he asked himself a question he did not want to ask. If someone was hurting his boy right now, wherever Thomas was, if some woman was shoving Thomas's face into a pig trough and nobody in the town would lift a finger, would he want a stranger to step in? The answer did not need to be spoken. Next morning, he rode into town instead of south toward the cattle buyers. Bishop turned east toward the White House at the edge of town as if the horse knew the way before Cole pulled the reins. Ida had a rule for everything. Rules for how to fold a towel. 3 creases lengthwise and then 1 across. Rules for how to sweep a floor. Start at the far corner and work in lines, never circles. Rules for how to stand and how to sit and how to answer when spoken to, and how to hold a broom and how to breathe if you thought about it hard enough, which Ellie sometimes did, because sometimes when Ida was watching, even breathing felt like something she could get wrong. But the only rule Ida truly cared about was rule number 1. Nobody comes near the fence. The fence around Ida's property was a split-rail affair standing about chest height on a man. It separated the yard from the road on 3 sides, and the pig pen covered the 4th. There was a front gate for visitors, which Ida opened when she chose, and a back gate for Ellie to haul water and slop, which Ida kept latched with a rope that Ellie could undo, but never fast enough if she needed to run. Nobody came to the fence uninvited. The miners walked past on the far side of the road. Mrs. Fenton sent her errands through the church. Even the Reverend did not stop by without sending word first. Ida had built a boundary around that property that was invisible and absolute, and everyone in Redstone Gulch understood it the way they understood rattlesnake country. You just did not go there. So when the tall man in the dust-caked hat walked up to the front fence at 9 o'clock on a Tuesday morning and called out a greeting toward the house, Ellie nearly dropped the shirt she was hanging on the line. She saw him from the side of the yard where the clothesline ran between 2 posts. He was leaning on the top rail of the fence with 1 boot propped on the bottom rail. The scar on his face caught the morning light. The cowboy from town. The one who had been sitting on Morrow's porch watching her walk by. She had noticed him noticing her, and it had frightened her because being noticed was never good. Being noticed was how you got hurt. "Morning," he called toward the house. "Anybody selling eggs this direction?" He had a reason to be here. Ida sold eggs to half the town. It was a legitimate cover, and Ellie understood that immediately the same way she understood everything, by reading between the lines, by listening for what people were not saying. Ida was not on the porch yet. Ellie kept her head down and her hands moving. Pin the shirt. Smooth the collar. Do not look up. "Ma Am is inside," Ellie said without looking at him. "If you want eggs, you can wait at the gate and she will come out." "I can wait." His voice was easy, unhurried, the voice of a man who spent most of his days in open country and did not rush because there was no one to rush for. Then quieter, almost casual. Is there a doctor in this town? Ellie's hands stopped on the clothespin, just for a heartbeat. Then they started again. Nearest doctor's in Helena, 2 days' ride. So when you get hurt, who patches you up? Silence. Ellie picked up another shirt from the basket. Her fingers were steady on the fabric, even though under her dress her heart was hammering so hard she was sure he could hear it across the yard. Eggs are 6 cents a dozen, she said. She walked to the hen coop and came back with a basket of brown eggs and crossed the yard to the fence. She held the basket over the rail toward him. Their fingers were close enough that she could see the calluses on his hands from rain and rope, close enough that if she reached just a little more, they would touch. She pulled back so fast she almost dropped the eggs. 6 cents, she said again. He dug in his pocket and put the coins on the fence post. He did not reach toward her, did not try to close the distance, just stood there on his side of the rail like a man who understood that the space between them was not empty. It was a wall. The screen door opened. Well now, what a pleasant surprise. Ida stepped onto the porch and Ellie felt her spine go straight the way it always did when that voice came from behind her, like a wire being pulled taut. But Ida was not angry. Ida was smiling. This was the Ida that terrified Ellie more than the spoon or the trough or the cellar. This was Sunday Ida, company Ida, the woman who served lemonade with one hand while the other hand stayed behind her back where nobody could see what it held. You must be the cattleman, Ida said, stepping off the porch. She extended her hand to Cole over the fence, and her grip was firm, and her smile was warm. I heard a herd came in from the south. Ida Pewitt Dawson, welcome to Redstone Gulch. Cole Masterson, ma'am. Just passing through. Needed some eggs, of course. Ellie, dear, bring Mr. Masterson some of that lemonade I made this morning. The poor man must be parched, driving cattle in this heat. Ellie went inside. Her legs were moving, but her mind was screaming. Ida was gathering intelligence. She could hear it in the questions drifting through the open window as she poured the lemonade. Where are you from, Mr. Masterson? How many head did you bring up? How long will you be staying? Is it just you, or do you ride with a crew? Where are you camped? Do you have business in town beyond the cattle? Every question a thread. Every answer a piece of a web Ida was building around this stranger, the way she built webs around everything and everyone. Ellie brought the lemonade out. Cole took the glass and thanked her, and his eyes met hers for just a second. And she looked away fast, because looking was dangerous, and Ida was watching. Ida was always watching. They talked for a few more minutes. Ida was charming. Ida was gracious. Ida asked about cattle prices and the trail from Cheyenne, and the weather out west, and she laughed at something Cole said about a stubborn horse, and the laugh sounded real. That was the thing about Ida. It always sounded real. Then one of the hogs slammed against the pen fence behind the house, squealing, agitated about something, maybe a snake in the pen, maybe just ornery. But the noise was sharp and sudden, and Ida turned her head toward it. 5 seconds. In those 5 seconds, Ellie looked at Cole directly. She shook her head once, sharp, definitive. Do not come back. Cole's eyes moved to her wrist. The sleeve of her dress had ridden up. On her wrist, a bruise fresher than the one he had seen yesterday. 4 fingers and a thumb, the shape of a hand that had grabbed and squeezed and held. New since yesterday. Ida turned back around. The 5 seconds were over. Well, Mr. Masterson, it has been a real pleasure. You stop by any time you need eggs. Ellie will have them ready. Won't you, Ellie? Yes, ma'am. Cole put his hat back on. He picked up the egg basket. Much obliged, ma'am. Fine lemonade. He tipped his hat and walked away. His boots on the hard-packed road sounded steady and unhurried. The walk of a man who covered long distances and did not rush. Ellie turned back to the clothesline. Her hands were shaking, but her face showed nothing. She had gotten very good at making her face show nothing. That evening, Ida did not hit her. That was worse. Ida waited until Ellie was washing the supper dishes. She came up behind her and stood close enough that Ellie could smell the lavender water Ida dabbed behind her ears every morning, close enough that Ellie could feel the heat of her body like a stove. Pretty thing is he not. Ida's voice was soft, almost tender. Think somebody cares about you? She put her hand on Ellie's shoulder. Not hard, just resting there, the weight of it like a stone. If he comes back, you will tell him you do not need help, will you not? Yes, ma'am. Good girl. Ida squeezed the shoulder once. Just enough. Just enough to say I am still here. I am still in control. You belong to me, and do not forget it. Then she went to the stove and ladled extra gravy onto Ellie's supper plate. You are getting weaker. Must be anemic again. Eat. You need the strength. Ellie sat down at the table. She picked up the spoon. The gravy was brown and thick, and it tasted the way it always tasted, like pennies, like something metallic that did not belong in food. She ate it because not eating meant punishment. She ate it because she did not know yet what the penny taste meant. She ate it because she had been eating it for 2 years, and she thought the shaking in her hands and the thinning of her hair at her temples and the dizziness on the road that morning were just what happened to a body that got hit too much and fed too little. She did not know yet, but she would. Later that night, she lay in the crawl space beneath the kitchen floor and listened to Ida's footsteps pacing above her. Slow, even. The metronome click of boot heels on pine. She thought about the cowboy at the fence. The way he had asked about a doctor. Not are you hurt, not who hits you. Just is there a doctor in this town? Careful, indirect. The way you approach a wild animal you do not want to spook. And the way he had left space at the fence. A full arm's length between them. Like he knew that getting close too fast was the same as hitting. Like he understood that for someone like Ellie, even kindness could feel like an ambush if it came at you without warning. She closed her eyes. Do not come back, she had told him with that look. She meant it. She also knew he would come back anyway. Cole lay in his tent that night, listening to Montana wind snap the canvas. He thought about Ida Puite's smile, the way she poured lemonade with her left hand while her right hand stayed behind her back. He did not see what the right hand held, but Ellie saw. Ellie always saw. There were 2 kinds of quiet people on the Western Road, those with nothing to say, and those with too much locked behind their teeth. Cole was the second kind. Ellie was a third, the kind for whom silence had become a mother tongue. He found her on the road to North Camp on a Wednesday morning. She was carrying a bundle of folded linens on her head with both arms raised to balance the load. Even from 50 yards, he could see she was favoring her left side. Ribs, probably, from the squeeze on the shoulder or from something else that had happened after the shoulder. With women like Ida, there was always something after. Cole had genuine business at the North Camp. The mining foreman's name was Holloway, and Cole had heard from Hank that Holloway sometimes bought beef for the camp kitchen. It was a real reason to be on this road, and he was glad for it because riding up alongside a girl who had told him not to come back required at least the appearance of coincidence. He slowed Bishop to a walk and came up on the far side of the road. Opposite side. A full road width between them. Stop following me. Ellie did not look at him. Her voice was flat. She has people watching. I am not following you. I am walking the same direction. Every time someone walks the same direction as me, I catch an extra beating. Then I will walk the other side of the road. He was already on the other side. She knew that. He could hear it in the small exhale she gave. Not quite a laugh. Not anywhere close to a laugh, actually. But something that acknowledged the absurdity of 2 people walking parallel down a dirt road, with 20 feet of empty space between them like a river neither one could cross. They walked in silence for a while. The sun climbed. The flies buzzed. Bishop's hooves made a steady rhythm on the hard-packed earth. You should not have come to the fence, Ellie said. She was still looking straight ahead. I needed eggs. You do not eat eggs. I saw your camp from the ridge road. You cook beans and jerky over a fire and you give the scraps to your horse. Cole blinked. You pay attention. I pay attention to everything. That is how you survive. More silence. A hawk circled overhead. Far off to the east, the mountains were purple against the morning sky. I have a son, Cole said. Ellie did not respond. But she did not tell him to stop talking either. His name is Thomas. He was 2 years old when I left for the war. When I came home, my wife was gone. She took him with her. I do not know where they are." He stopped. The words had come out in short pieces like boards being laid one at a time across a gap he was not sure he could cross. Ellie said nothing for 10 steps. 12, 15. "My father was a county clerk before he went down the mines," she said. "He taught me to read using court filings. It was all we had in the house. One detail, that was all she gave. But Cole understood. She was trading. One piece of herself for one piece of him. Equal weight. Fair exchange. The currency of two people who had nothing left to give except fragments of who they used to be." A freight wagon came up the road behind them, and they both stepped to the side. The wagon was loaded with mining equipment, picks and timber and coils of rope. On the bench sat a driver, and beside the driver, a middle-aged woman in a proper dress, and beside the woman, a girl. The girl was 14, maybe 15. She sat with her hands folded in her lap, and her back straight and her face blank. Not the blankness of boredom. The blankness of a creature that had learned there was no point in having an expression because expressions invited attention, and attention invited pain. Her eyes were empty as creek stones. The wagon passed. The dust settled. Ellie had stopped walking. She stood in the road looking after the wagon with a face Cole had not seen on her before. White, still. Something working behind her eyes that was deeper than her own pain. "You know them?" Cole asked. "Cole?" "No." Ellie's voice was barely there, but I recognized that look. She started walking again, faster now, like she was trying to outpace something that could not be outrun. They did not speak again until they reached the North Camp. The mining camp was a cluster of tents and shacks sprawled along a ridge where the copper vein ran close to the surface. Men moved between the shaft heads carrying tools. A stamp mill pounded somewhere out of sight. The air smelled of sulfur and sweat and blasting powder. Cole tied Bishop to a rail and went to find Holloway. While he waited outside the foreman's office, he watched Ellie deliver linens to one of the cabins. The foreman's wife came to the door. Her name was Margaret Holloway. She was a tall woman with capable hands and sharp eyes, and she talked with Ellie in a low voice that Cole could not hear. He saw Margaret slip something into the laundry bundle Ellie was carrying, something small, folded, tucked between the linens where it would not be seen unless you were looking for it. Ellie's hand closed over it. She tucked the bundle under her arm and walked away without looking back. Cole saw it. He did not ask about it. Some things you file away for later. He met with Holloway, talked about beef prices, made a half deal that would give him reason to come back to the camp if he needed one. Then he walked out into the road, and Ellie was gone. He stood there with Bishop cropping grass at the shoulder and looked down at his own hands. Big hands, scarred across the knuckles from rope and weather, and one bad night in Abilene, when he had broken a stock dealer's arm because the man was whipping a horse until it bled and Cole had watched the blood run down the horse's flank, and something had snapped inside him and he had stopped the whipping the only way he knew how. He looked at those hands, hands that had broken bones without thinking, and he wondered for the first time in his life whether they were gentle enough to help instead of wreck. 3 things Ellie knew for certain about Ida's gravy. It always tasted of pennies. It was cooked in a separate pot that Ellie was not allowed to touch. And every time she ate it, the world turned slower than it should. She had not connected these 3 things before. They were just facts. The way the cold in winter was a fact, and the bruises on her arms were facts, and the shaking in her hands was a fact. You did not question facts when you were busy surviving. You just absorbed them the way the ground absorbs rain. Without thinking, without choosing. But tonight, something was different. Tonight the gravy was sharper, more bitter, more metallic, like Ida had stirred something extra into the pot and been a little less careful about the dose. Ellie sat at the kitchen table across from Ida, and she ate because not eating meant punishment. Ida watched her eat the way she always watched. Steady, patient. The way a person watches a clock when they are waiting for something to happen. "Eat it all," Ida said. "You need your strength. You have been looking pale." "Yes, Ma, I am." Ellie cleaned the plate, washed the dishes, swept the floor, said goodnight, climbed down into the crawl space beneath the kitchen. And 2 hours later, she was on her hands and knees in the dark, vomiting into the dirt. There was blood in it. She could tell by the taste, even in the blackness. She had vomited blood before. Ida told her it was a weak constitution, told her she had always been sickly, told the women at church that Ellie had a stomach condition and was not strong, and that was why she was so thin, and that was why her hair was falling out at the temples, and that was why her hands shook. Ellie had believed it. Why would she not? She had no other explanation, and Ida said it with such conviction, and the doctor was 2 days away in Helena, and who was going to take her there? Nobody. Nobody was going to take her anywhere. She lay on the dirt floor in the dark with blood on her lips, and she thought about the folded paper Margaret Holloway had slipped into her laundry at North Camp 2 days ago. She had not opened it yet. She had been afraid. Afraid of what it might say. Afraid that knowing something new would change something, and change was dangerous, because change meant Ida would notice, and noticing meant the trough or the spoon or the cellar. But she was lying in her own blood in the dark, and the world was turning sideways the way it always did after the gravy, and her hair was thin at her temples, and her hands would not stop shaking, and she was 19 years old, and she was dying, and she did not even know why. She pulled the folded paper from the waistband of her dress where she had kept it pressed against her skin since the day Margaret gave it to her. She could not read it in the dark, but she did not need to. She smoothed it flat on the dirt floor, and she held it in her shaking fingers, and she waited. At first light, when the gray crept under the plank door, she unfolded it. It was a page torn from a medical text. Margaret Holloway owned books. Her husband kept them in the cabin. Medical references from back east. This page was from a chapter on toxicology. The heading read, "Chronic Arsenical Poisoning." Below it was a list of symptoms. Margaret had underlined each one. Tremor in the extremities, particularly the hands. Progressive hair loss, most notable at the temples. Nausea and vomiting, often with blood. Dizziness and episodes of syncope. Progressive muscle weakness. Metallic taste in food or water. Ellie read the list. She read it again. She held the page up to the thin morning light coming through the gap under the door, and she read it a third time. Her hands were shaking. Not from fear, not yet. From the poison that had been building in her bones for 2 years. She was not weak. She was not sickly. She did not have a bad constitution. She was being killed, slowly, deliberately, by the woman sleeping in the room above her. Ellie sat very still in the crawl space. The vomit on the dirt floor was drying. The light was growing. Above her, Ida's footsteps began. Slow today. Ellie's mind went cold, not numb. Cold. The cold of calculation. Of a girl who had spent 3 years learning to observe and memorize and read people's faces the way other girls learned to sew. She counted. How long had she been eating the gravy? Nearly 2 years. Every night. Every single night except the times Ida locked her in the cellar without food, which now seemed less like punishment and more like a break in dosage. A way to keep the levels from climbing too fast. Too fast would look suspicious. Slow was better. Slow looked like sickness. And the coldest question, the one that settled into her chest like a stone dropped into a well. Has Ida done this before? She remembered something. A year ago. Ida had gotten into the medicinal brandy, and her tongue had loosened the way it never did when she was sober. She had been sitting at the kitchen table talking to herself while Ellie scrubbed the floor, and she had said something that made no sense at the time. George had a weak stomach, too. Men are all weak. George Puitt, Ida's husband before Ellie's father, the man Ida had been married to in Helena, the man who died of a stomach ailment in 1877. Ellie had not thought about it then. She thought about it now. She folded Margaret's page into a thin strip and tucked it back into her waistband. Then she did something practical. Not dramatic, not a speech, not a cry. Something a girl who had been reading court filings since she was 9 would do. She took the napkin she had used at supper last night, the one she had wiped her mouth with, the one that still had traces of gravy soaked into the cloth. She wrapped it in a scrap of burlap. She pried up the third floorboard from the left in the crawl space, the one loose board Ida did not know about, and she hid the napkin underneath. Evidence. Preserved. Then she smoothed the board back into place and climbed out of the crawl space and went to feed the pigs like it was any other morning. From that night, Ellie stopped eating the gravy. She perfected a technique at the table. Spoon to mouth, napkin to lips, food transferred to the handkerchief in her lap. After supper, she dumped it in the privy behind the house when Ida was not looking. She was hungrier than before, but the world stopped spinning. Her hands still shook because arsenic does not leave the body that quickly. It sits in the bones, in the hair, in the organs. But for the first time in 2 years, she woke up in the morning without vomiting. And for the first time in 3 years, she had something Ida could not control. She knew the truth. 2 fires were burning in Redstone Gulch the second week Cole stayed on. One in the blacksmith's forge where he had brought Bishop to be reshod. The other in Ellie Dawson's eyes. And that fire nobody could put out. Cole told himself he was staying because he had not sold all the cattle yet. That was a lie, and he knew it. He had sold the last head 4 days ago to a buyer from Butte, who paid in gold coin and did not haggle. Cole had enough money in his saddlebag to ride to Oregon and start over. Instead, he was paying livery fees and buying meals at Hank's saloon, and sleeping on the ground beside a pasture he no longer needed. Because every time he thought about riding out, he saw the bruise on Ellie's wrist, the 4-finger shape, the pig feed in her hair, the way she walked the edge of the road like she was apologizing to the world for taking up space. He started gathering information the way he gathered cattle, slowly, patiently, moving in wide circles so nobody noticed the direction. He drank with the miners in the evening, listened more than he talked, asked about the town, about the mine, about the people who had been here longest. He learned that the copper vein was running thin, and half the camp would pull up stakes before winter. He learned that the Reverend's wife made the best huckleberry pie in the territory, but the Reverend himself had a weakness for the card tables in Silver Falls. And late one night, when Hank was 3 drinks past his limit, Cole learned something else. "Sam Dawson," Hank said. His eyes were red and his voice was loose. "Best man I ever knew. Honest, kind, worked hard. Loved that girl like she was made of gold. What happened to him? Mine collapse. Support timber gave way in shaft 4, his section. Killed him, and 2 other men." Hank stared into his glass. "Thing is, the timber in shaft 4 was inspected 2 weeks before. Foreman said it was sound. And Ida. She was the last one to bring Sam his lunch down in the shaft the day before it happened." Hank looked up at Cole with eyes that were blurry, but not blind. "I am not saying anything. I am just saying." Nobody asked questions because mine accidents are common, and when a woman cries at a funeral, people do not look too close at the tears. Cole sat with that for a long time after Hank fell asleep at the bar. The next day he met Ellie at the town well. It was a public place, safe because people came and went. A 2-minute window where they could talk without Ida's network noticing. He held out an apple from his saddlebag. Ellie took it. She turned it over in her hands, studied it, brought it to her nose and smelled it. Then she caught herself. Her face went red. She had just done the thing she did with every piece of food that came into her hands. The check. The test. Is it safe? Is there something in it? The reflex of a girl who had been eating poison for 2 years. Cole did not comment. He took another apple from the bag, bit into it, chewed, swallowed, then held it out to her. "This one I ate first. Safe." Ellie looked at him. It was a look he had not seen from her before. Not fear, not anger, not the blank mask she wore like armor. This was surprise. The surprise of a person who had forgotten that kindness was something that existed in the world. She took the apple. She bit into it. They stood at the well for maybe 2 minutes. They did not talk about Ida or bruises or poison. He told her Bishop had thrown a shoe, and she told him the blacksmith charged too much, and he said the blacksmith's wife made good biscuits, and she said she would not know because Ida did not let her eat at other people's houses. It was nothing. It was everything. It was 2 minutes of being a normal person standing in the sun talking about horseshoes and biscuits. Then Ellie walked away, and Cole watched her go, and that was that. Later that afternoon, Ellie was alone at the well hauling water. A stray dog trotted up from behind the dry goods store, brown and white, skinny, ribs showing, but its tail was wagging and its eyes were bright, and it came right up to Ellie and pushed its nose against her hand. She sat down on the ground, right there in the dirt beside the well, and she cried. Not about Ida, not about the poison, not about Cole or the bruises or the 3 years of hell she had been living. She cried because a dog wanted to be close to her, that was all. A skinny stray dog wanted to press its head against her hand with no conditions, no hidden motive, no blow waiting behind the kindness. And she could not remember the last time anything alive had wanted to touch her without hurting her. She cried for about a minute, hard, hitching sobs that bent her forward. Then she wiped her face with the back of her hand. She stood up. She scratched the dog behind the ears. And she walked away. Nobody saw it. Not Cole, not Hank, not Ruth Fenton. Just Ellie and the dog, and 1 minute of grief that had no name. That Sunday at church, Ida did something unexpected. She invited Cole to supper. She did it in front of the entire congregation, in her sweetest voice, in her best dress, with Reverend Whitley standing right there nodding and smiling. Mr. Masterson, you have been so kind buying our eggs, and I hear you have been doing business with the foreman up at North Camp. Please let me repay your patronage with a proper home-cooked meal. Thursday evening, 6:00. It was a trap, and everyone in the building knew it was a trap. But Ida had laid it in public, and refusing would make Cole the rude stranger who turned down a respectable widow's hospitality. He accepted. Behind Ida and 3 steps to the left, Ellie stood holding a hymnal. Her knuckles went white on the binding. Cole knew it was a trap. Ellie knew it was a trap. Ida knew they knew. And that was the part Ida liked best. Watching prey walk into a snare they could see plain as daylight, because they had no other choice. Ida's table was laid with a white cloth and candles and china plates. Ellie recognized the plates. Pale blue pattern on the rim, delicate scalloped edges. They were her mother's china. The set Ida told her she had sold 2 years ago to pay for winter feed. They were not sold. They were right here on the table, set out for company. Ellie looked at the pale blue rim, and she thought about her mother's hands. Hands she had never seen. Her mother died the day Ellie was born. But her father had described those hands so many times that Ellie could see them in her mind clear as water. Small hands, quick hands. Hands that had held these very plates and set this very table in the years before Ellie existed. And now Ida was serving poison on them. The guests arrived at 6. Cole came in clean clothes, his hat in his hands. His scar was vivid in the lamplight, and Ellie saw Mrs. Whitley look at it and look away too fast. And she saw the Reverend pump Cole's hand a little too hard the way men did when they were trying to seem bigger than they felt. Ida was magnificent. There was no other word for it. She moved through the evening like a woman born to host. She pulled out chairs. She poured cider. She told stories about Ellie as a little girl, stories that were entirely invented but delivered with such warmth and detail that even Ellie almost believed them. Oh, she was such a darling at 5 years old. Used to chase the chickens around the yard until she fell right into the mud. Remember that, sweetheart? Ellie's fingers tightened on her spoon. She nodded. Yes, ma am. I remember. She did not remember because it had never happened. At 5 years old, Ellie was already carrying water buckets and learning not to make noise when Ida was in one of her moods. Cole watched. He did not miss much. Ellie could tell because every time Ida put on a display of affection, every time she called Ellie sweetheart or darling or touched her shoulder, Cole's eyes would move to Ellie's hands, and Ellie's hands told the truth even when her mouth could not. Her fingers went tight, her knuckles went pale, her shoulders locked up like a board, the flinch of someone who has been hit after being stroked. Because with Ida, tenderness was always the warning sign for the next blow. Then Ida brought out the main dish: roast pork, potatoes, bread, and the gravy, in the separate pot, the cast iron one with the chipped handle that Ellie was never allowed to touch. Ida served everyone's plate from the large pot of regular gravy. Then she turned to Ellie's plate and served it from the smaller pot. "Eat up, darling. You need your strength." Ellie looked at the gravy, brown, thick. She could smell it. Pennies, metal, the smell that had been in her food for 2 years. She looked at Ida. Ida's face was warm and smiling and completely in control. She flicked her eyes toward Cole, so fast that nobody caught it. A quarter of a second, and Ellie ate, or appeared to eat. She brought the spoon to her mouth, touched it to her lips, moved the napkin, transferred the gravy to the cloth in her lap. She had been practicing this for weeks, and she was good at it now. Fast, clean, invisible. Ida did not notice because Ida was performing for the Whitleys, and performance required an audience, and Ellie had never been Ida's audience. Ellie was her prop. But Ellie noticed something. When Ida ladled the gravy from the small pot, her hand trembled, just slightly, a tremor in the fingers. Nobody else saw it. Cole was watching the Whitleys. The Reverend was watching his plate. Mrs. Whitley was watching the candles. But Ellie saw, and she recognized it. It was the same tremor that lived in Ellie's own hands, the shaking that she had thought was fear, and then learned was poison. But Ida was not being poisoned. Ida's tremor was something else. It was habit, routine, the mechanical repetition of an act done so many times that the body carried it out even when the mind was somewhere else. Ida's hands shook because killing had become ordinary, like sweeping, like pinning hair, like breathing. And in that moment, Ellie understood something that changed the way she saw the woman who had been mistreating her every day for 3 years. Ida was not a monster. Monsters were extraordinary. Ida was worse than a monster. She was ordinary. She was a system. A machine that converted human beings into labor and then into silence, and she could not stop running any more than a clock could stop ticking. Ellie did not pity her. You did not pity the machine that was grinding your bones, but she understood it. And understanding freed something inside her that hatred had been holding prisoner. She was not fighting a devil. She was fighting a pattern, and patterns could be broken. After supper, the Reverend pulled Cole onto the porch for a smoke. Ellie cleared the dishes, and she could hear their voices through the open window. "Mr. Masterson." The Reverend's voice was not threatening. It was tired. Bone tired. "I know what you are thinking. I thought the same when I first came here. But you do not understand how a mining town works. Ida Puitt is not just a woman. She is a system. She controls the eggs, which means she controls breakfast. She controls the laundry, which means she controls cleanliness. She controls the church donations, which means she controls moral standing. You cannot pull one brick without the whole wall coming down." Cole's voice was low. "So you chose to let the wall stand on the back of a girl." Silence. Whitley did not answer. But through the window, Ellie saw his hand shake, lighting his cigarette. Not from fear of Cole. From something heavier. Something that had been building for years in a man who knew right from wrong and chose wrong every single day because wrong was easier. Later that night, after the guests were gone and the dishes were washed and Ida had retired to her bedroom and locked the door. Later, after the house was dark and the only sound was the clock ticking in the parlor, Ellie did something she had never done before. She drugged Ida's tea. Ida kept a bottle of laudanum in the kitchen cabinet, medicinal, for headaches and monthly pains. Ellie measured a dose into the teacup Ida always drank from before bed, enough to put her into a deep sleep, not enough to raise suspicion. It was the first time Ellie had ever acted against Ida directly. Her hand shook so hard she almost spilled the laudanum. Her heart was pounding so loud she was sure Ida could hear it through the bedroom door. But Ida drank the tea, and 20 minutes later, the house was silent in a way it never was. Not the tense, watchful silence of a predator resting. The deep, still silence of a woman unconscious on laudanum. Ellie put on her boots. She opened the back door, and she ran. Cole was at his camp cleaning his saddle by the light of a low fire when he heard the footsteps. Fast, stumbling, someone running in the dark. He reached for the rifle beside his bedroll. Then he saw her. Ellie, face white, breathing hard. She had run the entire distance from the house to his camp, which was close to a mile, and her ribs were bad, and she was doubled over trying to breathe. "She is poisoning me," Ellie said. The words came out in pieces between gasps. "Arsenic. In the gravy. I have proof." She held out two things. The gravy-soaked napkin from tonight's supper still damp in her handkerchief, and the medical page Margaret Holloway had given her with the symptoms underlined. "Keep these," Ellie said. "If I die, give them to anyone who will test them." Cole took the handkerchief. He held it in both hands. And for the first time since Ellie had known him, his hands were not steady. They shook. "You are not going to die," he said. "You cannot promise that. You are right. But I can promise you will not die alone." Ellie looked at him in the firelight. The scar on his face threw a shadow. His hands were still shaking around the handkerchief. She had to go. Every minute she was gone was a minute Ida might wake up. She turned and ran back into the dark. Her shape disappeared between the buildings, and Cole stood there holding a napkin soaked in poison, and he wrapped it in oilskin and tucked it into his saddlebag. Then he sat down on the ground next to Bishop, and for the first time in 6 years, he prayed. Not for himself, for a girl running through the dark toward the house of the woman who was killing her. Cole's first plan was simple. Put Ellie on a horse and ride. Cole's first plan was also his worst, and he knew it before the sun cleared the ridge. You could not take a girl out of her legal guardian's home and ride into the territory without it being called kidnapping. Ida had guardianship papers signed by a judge in Helena. Sam Dawson had named Ida as guardian in his will because he did not know. He thought he was protecting his daughter. He thought Ida was a good woman who would keep Ellie safe. That will was a cage built by a dead man's love, and Cole could not break it by putting a girl on a horse. So he did what soldiers do when the first plan fails. He went to plan B. He rode straight to Ida's house, not to fight, to confront. He stood at the gate and he said it straight. "I know what you're doing. The gravy, the separate pot. I know what is in it. You stop, or I go to the law." Ida came to the porch. She was wearing a clean dress. Her hair was pinned. Her hands were folded. She looked at Cole the way a person looks at a stain on a tablecloth, with distaste and calculation. "Mr. Masterson, who do you think the law is going to believe? A respectable widow who has cared for her stepdaughter for 3 years? Or a drifting cattleman with no ties to this town and no standing in this community?" She tilted her head. Something moved behind her eyes. A light going on in a dark room. "I took the liberty of writing to Fort Worth about you." The name Cole Masterson turned up some very interesting reading. Something about a beating in Abilene. A stock dealer named Arthur Hadley. Broken arm, 2 broken ribs. There is a warrant. Cole felt the blood drain from his face. She had known. From the beginning. From the very first day he walked up to her fence to buy eggs. She had sent a letter to Texas that same day because Ida Puit investigated every stranger who came within arm's reach of her property. That was how she maintained control. She did not wait for threats to arrive. She mapped them before they knew they were threats. She had been 2 weeks ahead of him from the moment he rode into town. "You are a wanted man, Mr. Masterson," Ida said. Her voice was sweet as church music. "If I were you, I would sell the rest of my cattle and move along before someone sends a wire to the marshal's office in Fort Worth. It would be such a shame if you ended up in a jail cell. Who would look after that nice horse of yours?" She smiled. And it was the coldest smile Cole had ever seen on a human face. Colder than the smile of a man across a card table who knows he is holding a winning hand. Because Ida was not gambling. Ida had already won. She was just letting him know. Cole walked away from that porch, and he felt something building in his chest that he recognized. The same thing he had felt in Abilene when he watched Hadley whip that horse. The same thing he had felt in the war when the man next to him took a bullet and fell, and Cole could not do anything except keep moving forward. Rage, pure and hot, and looking for a target. He rode back to camp. He dismounted. He stood beside Bishop's saddle for a long moment, and then he did something he had promised himself he would never do again. He pulled his revolver from the saddlebag. He stood there holding it, not thinking about shooting, thinking about going back, kicking in her door, dragging her out by force, making her stop with the only language he knew for certain would work. He walked toward town. Bishop followed. The horse's steps got slower. Cole did not notice. He was walking fast, and his hand was on the gun, and his breathing was hard, and the scar on his face felt hot, the way it always did when his blood was up. He made it halfway to Ida's house. Then he stopped. Because the last time he had let anger lead the way, he had broken a man's arm in Abilene. And he had not been sorry about the reason. Hadley deserved it. The horse was bleeding. Someone had to stop it. But the loss of control. That was what Cole was sorry about. Because the loss of control in Abilene was the reason Ida had a warrant to hold over his head right now. His own violence from years ago was the chain she was using to strangle him today. If he went to that house with a gun, he would prove everything Ida had told the town about dangerous drifters. He would prove everything she was going to tell the law about a wanted man who terrorized a respectable widow. He would hand her the weapon she needed to destroy Ellie's last chance. Cole stood in the middle of an empty road with a revolver in his hand and the sun burning down on his shoulders. Then he put the gun back, turned Bishop around, walked back to camp. He sat on the ground with his head in his hands and he shook. Not from anger anymore, from fear. Fear of himself. Fear of what he almost did. Fear that the war had broken something inside him that could never be fixed, and that every act of violence from now until he died would be another link in the chain that kept him from the people he was trying to help. Bishop nudged his shoulder, looking for sugar. Cole put his hand on the horse's muzzle and held it there until his breathing slowed. That evening, Reverend Whitley appeared at Cole's camp. Cole looked up. He had not expected the Reverend. Nobody visited his camp. Whitley stood at the edge of the firelight, looking like a man who had not slept in 3 days. His collar was unbuttoned. His coat was wrinkled. He looked less like a preacher and more like a man who had been running from something and finally stopped because his legs gave out. "You should leave," Whitley said. "No greeting. No preamble. Ida will not stop at the warrant. She has connections in Helena, lawyers, a judge who owes favors to the mining company. She has been building a wall around herself for years, and you're not going to knock it down by standing outside it looking angry." Cole studied the Reverend's face. "Then why are you here telling me this?" "Because," Whitley paused, "because I am tired. I am tired of watching it and doing nothing and telling myself it is not my business. But I'm also not brave enough to help you. So the best I can do is warn you." He turned to leave. "Reverend," Whitley stopped. "How long have you known what she is doing to that girl?" Whitley did not turn around. His shoulders were hunched. The firelight made his shadow long and thin on the ground. "Since the first winter," he said quietly. "When she locked the girl in the cellar for 2 weeks and told everyone it was scarlet fever. I brought soup to the house, and Ida met me at the door, and I could hear the girl crying under the floor. I could hear it through the boards." He walked away into the dark. His footsteps faded. Cole sat alone by the fire and added this to the picture he was building. The Reverend knew. The Reverend had always known. And the Reverend was too weak to act and too guilty to keep quiet. And that made him both useless and invaluable. Because a guilty man with information is a weapon waiting to be used. That same night, Ida locked Ellie in the cellar. Not for the supper. Not for Cole's visit to the gate. For something smaller. The grocer's boy. 10 years old. Name of Caleb. Ida paid him a penny a week in candy to report on Ellie's movements in town. And Caleb had told Ida that Ellie and the cattleman had been walking on the same road to North Camp. On opposite sides of the road, yes. But the same road at the same time. That was enough. Ida did not hit her. She used the cellar. No food, no water, no light. The plank door shut and the latch dropped, and Ellie was in the dark. This was Ida's favorite punishment. It left no marks. Ellie sat in the blackness, and she did not curl up. She did not cry. She did not count the hours the way she used to. She thought. She thought about her father's words, words he had said to her when she was small, before Ida, before the mine, before everything went wrong. This house is yours, Ellie girl. The papers say my name, and after me they say yours. That is the law, and the law does not change just because a person dies. Her father had been a county clerk. He knew the law. He had taught Ellie the basics the way other fathers taught their daughters to cook or sew. He taught her about deeds and titles and guardianship and property rights, not because he thought she would need them, because they were what he knew, and sharing them was how he showed love. Ellie sat in the dark cellar, and she thought about the deed to this house. Her father had owned this property. He had bought it with money from his county clerk's salary before the copper boom pulled him into the mines. The deed was in his name, Samuel James Dawson. And when he died, the property should have passed to his next of kin. That was Ellie, not Ida. Ida was the guardian of Ellie's person. That did not make Ida the owner of Ellie's property. Guardianship and ownership were two different things. Her father had taught her that. But she was not certain. She had been 9 years old when he explained it, and the details were fragments. She needed someone to check the county records, someone to go to the recorder's office and look at the actual deed. She could not go herself. Ida would never let her. And even if she could get there, the clerk would not take her seriously. A 19-year-old girl who the whole town believed was slow in the head. She needed an ally. In the cellar dark, Ellie Dawson did something she had not done in 3 years. She planned, not to survive, to win. Above her, Ida paced the kitchen, and the boot heels ticked like a clock pendulum. And Ida did not know that beneath her floorboards the thing she believed she had killed long ago was waking up. Ellie Dawson's will had just opened its eyes. The storm hit Redstone Gulch on a Thursday afternoon, and it came from 3 directions at once. From the west came the actual storm. Black clouds stacked on the mountains like slabs of slate, and lightning cracking the sky in crooked white lines. The air went heavy and still the way it does in Montana before everything breaks open. From the south came Garrett Pike. He rode a black horse and wore a silver star on his coat, and he carried a warrant with Cole Masterson's name on it, signed by a judge in Fort Worth 6 weeks ago. He was a bounty hunter out of Texas, and he was not a man who entertained excuses. And from the east came Eugene Tate, Deputy Territorial Marshal, lean and spectacled and quiet, a man who read the law like scripture and applied it without exception. He had not been summoned. He had not been asked. He had come on business of his own. The 3 storms converged on the same afternoon, and by the time the rain started falling, Redstone Gulch would never be the same. Cole saw Pike first. Hard to miss. The black horse stood out on the street like a hearse at a wedding. Pike tied up outside Hank's saloon and walked inside and set the warrant on the bar, and said what bounty hunters always said. I am looking for Cole Masterson, cattleman out of Texas, wanted for aggravated assault. I have been told he is in this town. Hank looked at the warrant, looked at Pike, poured the man a whiskey. He is here, but you might want to hear the full story before you put irons on him. I do not need stories, I need a prisoner. Hank told him anyway. All of it. Ellie, Ida, the arsenic, the 3 years of beatings, the pig trough, the cellar. He talked for 10 minutes, and Pike listened with the flat professional patience of a man who had heard 100 excuses. When Hank finished, Pike set his glass down. That is a sad situation. Does not change the warrant. Cole found them 20 minutes later. He walked into the saloon and saw Pike, and he knew. The way you know when a storm front is about to hit. You can feel the pressure change. He did not run. He did not reach for a weapon he was not carrying. He walked up to Pike and stood there. "I will go with you," Cole said. "But give me 12 hours. There is a girl being poisoned in the White House at the end of this road. I am the only witness with physical evidence. If I leave now, that evidence goes with me and that girl dies." Pike studied him. Bounty hunters were professional readers of men. They had to be. Their life depended on knowing who would run and who would fight and who was telling the truth. 12 hours, Pike said. "If I find out you're lying, I do not wait another minute." While Cole and Pike circled each other at the saloon, Ellie was making her move. Ida had let her out of the cellar that morning. Not out of kindness. The pigs needed feeding and the laundry was piling up, and Ida could not do the work herself. That was the cruel arithmetic that kept Ellie alive. She was too valuable to kill quickly. Ellie fed the pigs. She gathered the laundry. And then she walked to Ruth Fenton's house and knocked on the front door. Ruth opened it. Her face registered surprise. In 3 years, Ellie had never come to the front door. She had always used the back. "Mrs. Fenton," Ellie said, "I need your help." Ruth stared at her. Ellie watched the emotions cross the older woman's face like clouds passing over a field. Surprise, fear, guilt. 3 years of guilt for paying 3 pennies and closing the door. 3 years of seeing bruises and choosing not to see them. "What do you need?" Ruth said. "I need you to go to the county recorder's office. I need you to look up the deed to the Dawson property on the East Road. I need to know whose name is on it." Ruth's hands twisted in her apron. "Why can you not go yourself?" "Because the clerk will not take me seriously. Ida has told everyone I am slow in the head. But he will take you seriously. You are a respectable widow. You pay your taxes. You have standing." Ruth was quiet for a long moment. Fear was fighting guilt, and guilt was fighting something else. Something that had been growing in Ruth Fenton for 3 years like a seed buried under snow. "I will go," Ruth said. She went. And she came back 2 hours later with 2 pieces of information. The first was confirmation. The deed to the Dawson property was in the name of Samuel James Dawson. It had never been transferred, never signed over, never amended. In the eyes of Montana territorial law, the property belonged to Sam Dawson's sole heir, Ellie. The second piece of information was something Ruth had not gone looking for. At the recorder's office, she had run into a man, lean, spectacled, wearing a marshal's badge on a plain brown vest. His name was Eugene Tate, and he was the deputy territorial marshal, and he was in the county on a completely separate investigation. A suspicious death in the town of Laurel, 60 miles east. A young woman, 22 years old, the stepdaughter of a widow named Ida Sutter. Ida Sutter. Ida's name before she married George Pruitt, before she married Sam Dawson, before she came to Redstone Gulch and built her cage of eggs and church donations, and compliant reverends and penny candy spies. Tate was following a trail of dead men and dead stepdaughters, and the trail led straight to Redstone Gulch. He had not been summoned. Nobody had written to him. Nobody had ridden 200 miles to beg for his help. He had come because the evidence in his own case pointed here, and that made all the difference. Because nobody could claim this was manufactured. Nobody could say Cole Masterson staged the arrival of a lawman. The convergence was organic, the coincidence was real. And sometimes that is how justice works. Not because one person moves heaven and earth, but because the truth has a weight of its own, and eventually it bends the road toward the people who need to find it. Meanwhile, Ida was not idle. She heard about Pike through her network, the grocer's boy, the miner's wife, the child who earned penny candy for information. Ida learned that a man with a Texas badge had arrived looking for Cole Masterson and she assumed this meant her problem was solving itself. But Ida never relied on a single plan. She began preparing to leave. She lit the cook stove at 2 in the afternoon, which was wrong for June in Montana when nobody needed a fire. She began burning papers, letters, records, the things she kept in the locked drawer of her writing desk that documented the money transfers and the correspondence with the law office in Helena. Ruth saw the smoke. She was walking back from the recorder's office, and she looked up and saw chimney smoke rising from Ida's house in the middle of a summer afternoon. And Ruth Fenton, who had spent 3 years closing her door, did something she had never done before. She walked directly to Ida's front porch and knocked. "Ida, I brought your eggs." Ida came to the door, surprised, irritated, but unable to refuse because refusing eggs from Ruth Fenton would look strange, and Ida never did anything that looked strange. They talked at the front door for 3 minutes. Ruth made small talk. Weather, church, the Reverend's sermon last Sunday. And while they talked, Ruth looked past Ida through the front window into the kitchen. She could see the stove with the fire burning. She could see papers on the table. She could see Ida's writing desk with the drawer open. She memorized what she could see. Dates on the papers, names, a ledger book, the stub of a telegraph form. Her hands were shaking the entire time. She dropped 2 eggs walking back to the road. She did not care. At 4 in the afternoon, the 3 storms converged. Cole, with Pike behind him, walking east from the saloon. Tate, with his files, walking west from the recorder's office. Ruth running north from Ida's house. They met in front of Hank Morrow's saloon. Hank stood in the doorway holding a bottle. He looked at Cole. He looked at Pike. He looked at Tate with the badge. He looked at Ruth with the egg basket and the shaking hands. "Lord Almighty," Hank said. "Finally." They went inside. Tate heard everything. From Cole, he got the handkerchief evidence. The napkin soaked in gravy. The medical page from Margaret Holloway. From Ruth, he got the deed confirmation and the list of what Ida was burning. From his own files, he got the death in Laurel, the pattern. The name Ida Sutter connected to Ida Puett, connected to Ida Dawson. 3 names, 3 dead men, 3 stepdaughters who ended up in the ground or barely survived. "This is not a child abuse case," Tate said. He took off his spectacles and cleaned them, which was something he did when he was recalculating. "This is a serial murder case." Pike listened from the bar. His attitude shifted. Not sentimental, professional. "If this woman faces territorial criminal charges," Pike said, "then your cattleman is a material witness. A material witness under territorial subpoena cannot be extradited on a lesser warrant until the territorial proceedings are concluded. I am not tearing up the warrant, but he stays here until the marshal is done. Territorial law over state warrant." Cole stayed. Ellie was at Ruth's house writing. She had a sheet of paper and a pen, and she was writing a letter granting Deputy Marshal Tate permission to search the property at the Dawson residence on the East Road. She wrote it from memory, from the fragments her father had taught her about property law and owner's rights and authorization of search. She cited the provision she remembered about a property owner granting access to law enforcement. She got the subsection number wrong. She wrote 14 when it should have been 17. A small error, the kind of mistake a 19-year-old girl writing from memory in a kitchen would make. Tate read the letter. He caught the error, and he corrected it himself. Territorial law allowed a marshal to amend technical errors in a valid authorization when the substance was sound. The substance was sound. The property belonged to Ellie. Ellie was granting permission. The law allowed the search. Tate folded the letter into his vest pocket and put his hat on. The real storm broke over Redstone Gulch at dusk, rain hammering the tin roofs like buckshot, thunder shaking window glass. 5 people stood in Hank Morrow's saloon looking through the rain toward the White House at the end of the East Road, where a single lamp still burned in the kitchen window. A small, ordinary, steady light. And behind that light, a woman was burning evidence and preparing to vanish. Morning after the storm, Redstone Gulch looked scrubbed clean. The red mud was washed off the boardwalks. The air was sharp and bright, and smelled of wet sage. The sun came up clear and strong over the eastern ridge, and it was the kind of light that made everything look new. Like the world had been taken apart in the night and put back together with the dirty parts left out. Ellie Dawson stepped off Ruth Fenton's porch and stared directly into that sun for the first time in 3 years without lowering her eyes. Tate went to Ida's house at first light. He carried the search authorization in his vest pocket alongside his badge and his spectacles case. Cole walked with him. Pike walked behind Cole. Ruth Fenton stayed back with Ellie because Tate said if Ellie was present at the search, any future lawyer would argue she had influenced the result. Ellie had to wait. That was the hardest part. Harder than the cellar. Harder than the trough. Sitting in Ruth's kitchen with her hands flat on the table, trusting other people to do what she could not do herself. She had spent 3 years trusting no one. Now she had to trust 4 strangers and a lawman who had failed her twice before. She sat and she waited, and her hands shook on the table, and Ruth sat across from her, and neither of them spoke. At Ida's house, the door was open. The gate was unlatched. The yard was empty. Ida was gone. The kitchen stove was cold, ashes in the firebox. The writing desk drawer was open and empty. Papers had been burned. The smell of charred paper still hung in the air. She ran, Cole said. Tate did not answer. He began the search methodically. Kitchen first, pantry, the writing desk, the bedroom, the cellar crawl space where Ellie had slept for 3 years on a dirt floor. He found the crawl space, and he stood there looking at it for a long time. A hole in the ground barely big enough for a person. No blanket, no pillow, just packed earth and the smell of root vegetables and a single boot print in the clay. Tate took off his spectacles and cleaned them. His jaw was tight. He put them back on and kept searching. Ida had been thorough. Most of the evidence was burned. The papers were ash. The separate gravy pot was gone. She had taken it with her. But Ida had made 2 mistakes. The first was a coat. Her winter coat hung on a hook behind the kitchen door. In the pocket, Tate found a small glass vial, half empty. White powder, fine as sugar, force of habit. The way a woman keeps her reading glasses in the same pocket of the same coat for years. Ida had carried arsenic on her person so long that she had forgotten about the vial in the coat she was not wearing in June. The second mistake was something Ida could not have known about. Hank came running up the road from Ruth's house. He was out of breath and his face was red. "Marshall," Ellie says to check the 3rd floorboard from the left in the cellar. Tate went back down. He counted the floorboards. 1, 2, 3 from the left. He pried it up. Underneath was a bundle wrapped in burlap. Inside the burlap was a napkin stained with brown gravy. Preserved. Ellie had hidden it there weeks ago, before Cole, before Ruth, before Tate. She had saved the evidence herself because she had learned in 3 years of survival that the only person you could rely on completely was yourself, her weapon, her timing, her control. Tate held the napkin up to the light. He did not need a chemist to tell him what was in it, but he would send it for testing anyway, along with the vial from the coat pocket. He issued the warrant from Ida's own porch. Territorial warrant for the arrest of Ida Pwitt Dawson. Attempted murder by arsenical poisoning. 2 counts of suspected homicide pending exhumation of George Pwitt and William Sutter. Fraud. Child abuse under territorial statute. The case would be tried in the territorial court at Deer Lodge, where the territorial prison stood. Prosecuted under Montana Territory criminal law. Tried before the territorial district judge. Not a county matter anymore, not a family matter, a territorial criminal case with a serial pattern. Then Whitley arrived. He came up the road from the church walking slowly. He was carrying something under his arm, a packet of papers tied with string. Everyone on the porch expected him to argue, to defend Ida, to obstruct. Instead, Whitley walked up the steps and knelt down. He actually knelt on the porch boards in front of Eugene Tate. "I have information," Whitley said. His voice was steady, but his hands were not. "Ida has been sending money to an address in Billings every month for 2 years. I have been routing the transfers through the church post office. She asked me to, and I did it because she told me to, and I did everything she told me to, because she knew things about me that I could not afford to have known. He held out the packet. I kept copies of every receipt, every transfer, dates, amounts, the address and billings. Tate took the packet. He did not thank Whitley. He opened it and read the first page, and his eyebrows moved, but otherwise his face showed nothing. The receipts confirmed what Tate already suspected. Ida had an escape route prepared for years. The money transfers were funding a secondary life in Billings, a boarding house, a new name. The infrastructure of a woman who always planned to run and had been laying the groundwork since the day she arrived in Redstone Gulch. Premeditation, documented, in Ida's own handwriting on the transfer forms. Tate put the receipts in his vest pocket alongside the search authorization and the arrest warrant. His vest was becoming a filing cabinet. He looked at Whitley still kneeling on the porch. "The church building fund," Tate said. "That will be a matter for the county." "Yes, sir. I understand." Tate walked past him and down the steps. Whitley remained on his knees for a moment longer. Then he got up and walked back toward the church. Nobody watched him go. 2 days later, Tate received a wire. Ida had been arrested in Billings by the local sheriff. She was being held in the Yellowstone County Jail, awaiting transfer to Deer Lodge for trial. There was no dramatic confrontation, no scene where Ellie stood before Ida and delivered a speech. Ida did not deserve a final scene. And Ellie did not need to speak to Ida. She needed to speak for herself. Pike came to Ruth's porch on the morning after the wire arrived. "The warrant is suspended," Pike said. "You are a material witness in a territorial murder case. I cannot extradite you until the proceedings are concluded. After that, you and I will have a conversation about Arthur Hadley's arm." Cole nodded. He had known this was coming. "The marshal wrote a letter to the Texas court," Pike continued. "And your friend in there wrote something too." He pulled a folded paper from his coat. "A legal argument. Defense of a minor provision. Section 14 of the Texas Criminal Code. Says an assault charge can be reduced if committed in defense of a minor child's welfare." Pike looked at the paper. "I am not a lawyer, but this reads solid. If you can establish that Hadley was engaged in cruelty to an animal in your presence, and your response was disproportionate but provoked, you might get the charge reduced to a misdemeanor. Maybe dropped." He paused. "Who wrote this?" "It is better than most of the briefs I have seen from actual attorneys." Cole almost smiled. A girl who learned to read from court filings. Pike folded the paper and put it back in his coat. He looked at Cole for a long moment. Then he walked to his black horse and stood there adjusting the girth strap. "Masterson. Yeah, that girl in there. She is something." "I know." Cole stood on Ruth's porch and he looked down the road and he knew it was time. He had to go. Not today, not this hour, but soon. Pike would wait for the territorial case to conclude, and then Cole would ride south with him to Texas and face the Abilene charge. And somewhere on that road between Montana and Texas, he would find a way to turn west toward Portland, where a boy named Thomas Cole Masterson was growing up without him. But not today. Today he had something to do first. He found Ellie in Ruth's kitchen. She was sitting at the table with a cup of tea she had not touched. Her hands were on the table, still shaking. The arsenic was still in her bones. It would take months to leave, maybe longer. Some of it might never leave. "I have to go soon," Cole said. "I know. Pike will wait until the case goes through, then Texas." "I know. And after Texas, Portland. Thomas." Ellie nodded. She picked up the teacup, put it down, picked it up again. "You should go," she said. "Find your boy. Hold him. Tell him you are sorry for every year you were not there. That matters more than anything else you could do with the rest of your life." Cole sat down across from her. "What about you?" "What about me?" Ellie's voice was steady. "I have a house." "My house. My father's house." Tate confirmed the deed. "I am going to fix it up. The first thing I am going to do is tear out the cellar. Fill it with dirt. Make it a root storage like it was supposed to be. Second thing I'm going to do is get rid of the pig trough. She paused. Third thing, I might get a dog. A real dog. Not a guard dog. One that sleeps on the bed and gets hair on everything. Cole looked at her. This girl. This thin, shaking girl who had been mistreated every single day for 3 years. Who had her face pushed into pig slop and her food laced with arsenic and her body locked in a hole under the kitchen floor. Who had survived all of it not by being saved, but by being smart enough and stubborn enough and angry enough to save herself. She had hidden evidence under a floorboard. She had memorized the deed to her own house. She had written a legal defense for a man she barely knew because she had learned to read from court filings in a house that no longer had any books because the woman who was killing her had burned them all. You are going to be all right, Cole said. I am going to be more than all right. I am going to write to the county library in Helena and borrow every book on territorial law they have. And when I have read them, I am going to find a way to make sure no girl in this territory ever gets locked in a cellar while the whole town looks the other way. Cole stood up. There was a thing he wanted to say, and the words were right there behind his teeth, and his stutter was waiting for them, the way it always waited when the words mattered most. I will come back, he said. The stutter caught on the see and come. Just a small hitch. A half-second of sound stuck in his throat. Ellie looked at him. I know, she said. You stutter when you mean it. He left the kitchen and walked outside and mounted Bishop and rode to the end of the road where Pike was waiting. Then he stopped. He turned Bishop around. Rode back to Ruth's porch. Ellie was standing in the doorway. Cole did not speak. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out an apple. The last one. He set it on the porch rail. Then he turned Bishop south and rode away. Ellie stood in the doorway and looked at the apple sitting on the rail. She remembered the day at the well when he had bitten into one first and held it out to her. This one I ate first. Safe. This time he did not bite it, because he knew she did not need anyone to taste her food for her anymore. She picked up the apple. She bit into it. Sweet. She stood on the porch eating it and watching the dust settle on the road where Cole and Pike had been, and she did not cry. Then she walked to the white house at the end of the east road. Her house. She went around back to the yard where the pig trough sat in the dirt like an open grave. She went to the woodshed and took out the splitting axe. She carried it to the trough and she swung. The first swing was weak. Her hands were shaking, and the oak was thick, and the axe bit in about half an inch. The second swing was stronger. The third swing cracked the side rail, and a piece of wood split off and fell into the dirt. Then someone was beside her. Ruth Fenton. She had followed Ellie from her house. She did not say a word. She just held out her hands for the axe when Ellie's arms got tired, and she swung. Then Hank was there. He had walked from the saloon carrying a hatchet. He did not say anything either. He just started chopping. Then Margaret Holloway, who had ridden down from North Camp. Then a miner Ellie did not know by name. A big man with soot on his hands who had watched Ellie walk past his camp every morning for 3 years and done nothing. He was doing something now. They broke the trough apart together. Nobody spoke. The sound of iron on wood rang out in the still morning air, and nobody in Redstone Gulch asked what it was because everyone knew. The whole town knew what that trough was and what had been done in it, and they had known for 3 years, and the sound of it being destroyed was the only apology they knew how to make. When it was done, they left, one by one, without ceremony. Margaret touched Ellie's shoulder as she passed. Hank tipped his hat. The miner nodded once. Ruth stayed a moment longer. 3 years, Ruth said. Her voice was rough. I paid you 3 pennies for 6 hours of work, and I closed my door. I will not close it again. She walked back up the road. Ellie stood alone over the pile of broken oak. The hogs nosed at the wreckage from inside the pen, confused, sniffing at the splintered wood, not understanding what it had been or what it meant or why it mattered. She looked at the pile for a long time, then she went inside. She sat down at the kitchen table, her mother's table, the table where her father had taught her to read, the table where Ida had served poison in a cast-iron pot and called it gravy. She pulled out a sheet of paper. She dipped the pen. She wrote a letter. Not a legal brief, not a defense. A letter to the county library in Helena requesting permission to borrow books on territorial law. She signed it. Eleanor Ruth Dawson. Her hand still trembled, putting the pen down. The ink had not dried. She had to sit and wait with both hands flat on the table, watching her name appear stroke by stroke as the ink soaked into the paper grain. Eleanor Ruth Dawson. Outside the window, wind moved across the yard where the trough's broken planks lay drying in the sun. The stray dog she had met at the well the week before was lying on the porch, muzzle resting on its forepaws, eyes closed. It had followed her from Ruth's house, and now it was lying on her porch like it had always been there. Ellie looked at the dog, looked at her name on the paper, looked at the kitchen. Clean, bare, quiet. A different kind of quiet. Not the silence of fear. The silence of a house, waiting for someone to decide what it would become. She stood up, opened the door, called the dog inside. And that was how Ellie Dawson stepped out of the cage. Not all at once, not in a blaze of glory, one day at a time, one door at a time, one voice that had been beaten silent for 3 years finally speaking loud enough to reach across the distance. If this story moved you, stay with me. Hit that subscribe button. Every like helps this story reach someone who needs to hear it, someone who might be sitting in their own cellar, waiting for a light that has not come yet. Share it. Pass it on. Sometimes a story is the hand that reaches through the window in the dark. Drop a comment and tell me what city you're listening from tonight. I want to know how far Ellie's voice has traveled. Because that is the whole point. A voice that was beaten silent for 3 years just spoke loud enough to reach you. Do not let it stop. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.